All right, let's jump right into it. Today in The Explainer, we're taking on a huge topic, World War II, the single deadliest conflict in all of human history.
Okay, let's start with just one number. 60 million. That's the estimate. 60 million people, soldiers and civilians, dead. I mean, it's a figure that's almost impossible to wrap your head around. But to put it in perspective, that was about 2.5% of the entire global population at the time. Just gone.
So that leads to the big question, right? How? How on earth did something like this happen? How did the world get dragged into the most catastrophic war we've ever known?
All right, let's get into it. To really get a grip on the war, you've got to go back to the years before it all kicked off, to see how the seeds of this massive conflict were planted.
You can see it right here. This wasn't some random accident. It was a clear, step-by-step path to war. It didn't happen overnight, not at all. You could say the fuse was lit way back in 1919 with the Treaty of Versailles, which left this deep, simmering anger from World War I. And that resentment? Well, it was the perfect fuel for politicians like Adolf Hitler, who became chancellor in 1933. He knew exactly how to use it. And from there, look, it's just one deliberate escalation after another. Remilitarizing the Rhineland in 36, a direct violation of the treaty. Annexing Austria in 38, and then, the final straw, invading Poland in 1939. That was it. That's what started the war in Europe.
And a huge piece of this puzzle, a key idea driving all this expansion, was something called Lebensraum. It literally translates to living space. Now, this was a central, core part of Nazi ideology. The belief was that Germany needed to expand, that it had a right to take over new land, especially to the east, for its people. It was basically a political and racial excuse to invade their neighbors.
And the ideology behind all this, it was there from the very, very beginning. And this is what's so chilling. Take a look at this quote. This isn't from the middle of the war, no. This is from a letter Hitler wrote all the way back in 1919. The complete extirpation of the Jews, his words. It just shows you, this wasn't some idea that developed later on. It was a cornerstone of his worldview right from the start.
Okay, so the fuse is lit, the stage is set. Now let's watch how what started as a European war completely engulfed the entire planet.
So Germany unleashes this terrifying new way to fight. They called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war, and it was exactly that. Super fast, super coordinated attacks with tanks, the Panzers, and screaming dive bombers. The sheer speed was just shocking. Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, even mighty France, they all just collapsed one after another in a matter of months. It completely shattered everything people thought they knew about defensive warfare.
But right in the middle of all that chaos and collapse, something incredible happened. A moment of pure defiance. 338,000. That's how many Allied soldiers were completely trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk in France. And in this amazing effort, Operation Dynamo, a whole fleet of ships, military vessels, but also hundreds of regular civilian boats, fishing boats, yachts, you name it. They sailed right across the channel under constant fire to rescue them. It was this heroic act that saved the British Army and allowed them to keep fighting.
So pretty quickly, the world split into two sides. You had the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan at the core. They were all linked up by these pacts, and their goal was pretty clear: carve out new empires for themselves in Europe and Asia. And then you had the Allied powers. At first, it was mainly the UK and France. But that alliance was about to get a lot bigger, eventually including the Soviet Union and the United States. They all came together in this massive coalition, with just one thing on their minds: stop the Axis.
And 1941, that's the year this thing really went global. No question. In June, Hitler makes a fatal mistake. He turns on his ally, Stalin, and launches this gigantic invasion of the Soviet Union. Then, just 6 months later, Japan pulls off a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. And just like that, the sleeping giant, America, is in the war. From that point on, you can feel the tide start to shift. You get the massive D-Day invasion in Normandy in 44, and then the final chapter in Europe plays out in April of 45, with Soviet troops fighting street by street into the very heart of Nazi Germany, Berlin itself.
But winning, gosh, it came at a price that's just unimaginable. We really need to stop for a second and try to grasp the sheer human cost of it all. So let's go back to that 60 million number. when you actually break it down, one devastating fact just jumps out at you. The single biggest group of casualties? Civilians. This was what they called total war. It was a new kind of conflict where that line between a soldier on the battlefield and a person at home, it was erased, completely and deliberately.
And the physical destruction was on the same scale. I mean, it's just staggering. The combination of mobile armies and these massive bombing campaigns literally flattened entire cities. Rotterdam, Berlin, Hiroshima just wiped off the map. Across Europe and Asia, something like 3 million buildings were destroyed. Millions were left homeless, and entire economies were just rubble.
And then there's the horror at the very heart of the war. A cold, calculated, systematic genocide. And you have to understand, it didn't just start with concentration camps. No, it started with paperwork. It started with laws. Between 33 and 39, the Nazis passed over 1,400 laws specifically targeting Jewish people. They organized boycotts, they seized businesses, they stripped people of their rights, their citizenship, they cut them off from the rest of society. It was this slow, methodical process designed to dehumanize an entire group of people long before the killing started.
And this change, it wasn't a secret. The shift in language was public, and you couldn't miss it. This quote here, it's from the official SS newspaper in 1938. There's no hiding the meaning. The talk wasn't just about persecution anymore. It had turned into something far, far more sinister. Absolute annihilation. The goal was now out in the open for everyone to see.
But you know, even staring into the face of that kind of horror, the human spirit, it's a powerful thing. It just refused to be broken. All across occupied Europe, regular people, ordinary citizens, they formed resistance groups. They fought back. And sometimes, the fight was a song like Bella Ciao. It started out as just an old folk tune, but it became this incredibly powerful anthem for the Italian partisans, a symbol of freedom that spread across the entire continent.
So, when the guns finally fell silent, the world didn't just go back to the way it was. No way. The old world was gone, and out of its ashes, something completely new was about to be built.
And the change was, well, it was fundamental. The world before the war, it was dominated by a handful of European colonial powers. Great Britain, France. That world was completely shattered by 1945. Gone. And in its place stood two new giant rival superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. This massive power shift is what set the stage for the next half-century of global politics, what we now call the Cold War.
The economic shift was just as mind-blowing. Think about it. The United States mainland was never a battlefield. So its factories, its infrastructure, it was all intact. And it became, without a doubt, the economic engine of the entire planet. By the time the war ended in 1945, the U.S. was cranking out more than half of all the goods made in the entire world. Meanwhile, everyone else was just trying to figure out how to rebuild from the rubble.
So to try and make sure a disaster like this could never ever happen again, the world's leaders got together and tried to build a whole new global system. This is where institutions like the United Nations came from. The idea was to have a place to talk, to cooperate, to sort out problems peacefully. And at the same time, you get bodies like the World Bank and the IMF, which were set up to create economic stability and help put the global economy back on its feet.
So you see, World War II didn't just end. It completely remade the world. It forged a new global order, the one that defined the rest of the 20th century, and honestly, we're still living with its aftershocks today. Which leaves us with one last, really important question to think about. The world that was built from those ashes, how long is it going to last?